At 16, he was cast out with nothing but a key and a cryptic message. But inside an abandoned Quonset hut filled with hay, he found a hidden inheritance that would force him to choose between a fortune and his family's honor. If you've ever felt lost, if you've ever had to start over with nothing, this story is for you. Maybe hit that subscribe button, because we're all just trying to find our way home. Let's get into it. The day I turned 18, I was given two things: a bus ticket and an envelope. The ticket was one way, heading north into a part of the state that was mostly just green smudges on a map. The envelope was old, the paper softened by years of being folded and unfolded. Inside was a single, heavy, old-fashioned brass key and a sheet of notepaper with an address and 5 words written in my grandfather's shaky hand. The answer is in the cold. I had been in the system for 2 years, ever since my grandfather, my only family, had passed away. 2 years of group homes, of caseworkers who tried their best but had too many files on their desks, of learning to make myself small and quiet. 2 years of waiting for this day. My 18th birthday wasn't a celebration, it was an eviction notice from the life I knew. The state's responsibility for me was over. I was an adult. I was free. It felt a lot more like being thrown to the wolves. The bus shuddered as it pulled away from the station, the city's grime-streaked windows sliding past like a movie I was glad to see the end of. I pressed my forehead against the cool glass, the vibration of the engine a dull hum that traveled up through my bones. I had a duffel bag on the seat next to me, containing 3 changes of clothes, a worn paperback, and $112 in cash. My final allowance and the leftover scraps from under-the-table jobs. It wasn't much, but it was everything. I clutched the envelope in my jacket pocket, the sharp edges of the key a constant pressing reminder. My grandfather had been a quiet man, a gardener and a tinkerer who smelled of soil and oil. He never had much money, but our little apartment had been filled with light and plants. When he got sick, everything fell apart quickly. The apartment was lost, his things were sold off to pay debts I didn't understand, and I was handed over to a system that saw me as a case number. He'd given the envelope to his lawyer, a woman I'd never met, with strict instructions it was not to be given to me until I was a legal adult. A final gift, or a final burden, I wasn't sure which. The bus groaned onto the highway, and the city began to dissolve behind us, replaced by an endless sprawl of suburbs that eventually thinned into farmland. I watched the power lines dip and rise, counting them without thinking. My caseworker, a tired woman named Maria, had tried to talk me out of it. "Leo," she'd said, her voice gentle but firm, "this is a ghost town. The address is for a derelict property. There's nothing there for you. We can find you a spot in a transitional housing program, get you on your feet." I just shook my head. A promise was a promise. Before he died, in the sterile quiet of the hospital room, my grandfather had made me lean in close. His voice was a dry whisper, like leaves skittering across pavement. "Don't let them take it all, Leo. Protect the heart." I hadn't understood then, and I didn't really understand now. But the key in my pocket felt like the last piece of him I had left. Following his final wish was the only thing that felt real in a world that had become a blur of temporary beds and indifferent strangers. The farther the bus traveled, the more the world outside the window seemed to be emptying out. The 4-lane highway became 2 lanes. The chain restaurants and gas stations replaced by clapboard farmhouses and fields of corn stubble, brown and brittle under a pale autumn sky. The other passengers were few and far between, a young mother with a sleeping baby, an old man in a seed corn cap who stared out the window with the same blank intensity as me. We were all running from something, or to something, or maybe just running. I pulled out the note again. The address was for a town called Havenwood. Even the name sounded like a lie. There was no haven, not for people like me. There was just the next place, the next challenge. The 5 words, "The answer is in the cold," were what kept circling in my mind. Was it a riddle? A warning? My grandfather loved puzzles, but this felt different. It felt heavy. The sun began to set, painting the flat, empty landscape in shades of orange and deep purple. The world grew dark, and my own reflection stared back at me from the window. A pale, thin face with eyes that looked older than 18. I looked like a ghost already. I wondered what I would find in Havenwood. An empty lot? A pile of rubble? Maria was probably right. It was a fool's errand, a child's fantasy. But it was the only thing I had. When you have nothing, a fantasy can feel a lot like hope. I closed my eyes, trying to summon a memory of my grandfather's face. Not the sick, hollowed-out version from the hospital, but the one I grew up with. The face that crinkled at the corners of his eyes when he smiled. The hands that were always calloused and stained with earth. I remembered him teaching me how to tell the difference between weeds and seedlings, his voice patient and low. "Everything has a purpose, Leo," he'd say, holding up a tiny green shoot. "You just have to be patient enough to see it." I hoped he was right. I hoped there was a purpose to this journey, to this key, to the aching emptiness in my chest. The bus driver's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing a 10-minute stop at a roadside diner. I didn't move. I couldn't afford to spend any of my dwindling cash on a hot meal. The hunger in my stomach was a familiar ache, one I could manage. It was the other hunger, the one for answers, for a place to belong, that felt unbearable. I leaned my head back against the seat and waited for the bus to move again, taking me deeper into the cold, empty unknown. The rest of the journey passed in a half-dream state. I drifted in and out of a light, uneasy sleep, the kind where you're still aware of the rumble of the tires on the asphalt and the hiss of the air brakes. Each time I woke, the darkness outside seemed more complete, more absolute. We were in the heart of the country now, where the towns were just brief constellations of light in a vast sea of black. When the driver called out, "Havenwood," his voice sounded tired and tinny. I was the only one who moved. I grabbed my duffel bag and stumbled down the aisle, my legs stiff from sitting for so long. The bus door opened with a pneumatic sigh, releasing me into the night. The air was shockingly cold, a clean, sharp cold that bit at my exposed skin and made my breath plume in front of me. It smelled of pine and damp earth, a world away from the city's perpetual exhaust fumes. The bus pulled away, its red tail lights shrinking until they were swallowed by the darkness, and then I was alone. Utterly. The bus had dropped me at a crossroads. There was no station, not even a shelter. Just a single, flickering street lamp casting a sickly yellow glow on a cracked patch of pavement. In one direction, the road disappeared into the black. In the other, I could just make out the dim shapes of buildings. That had to be the town. I pulled my thin jacket tighter and started walking. Havenwood was not a ghost town, not exactly. It was a town on life support. The main street consisted of a dozen or so single-story buildings, most of them dark. A few windows glowed with the blue light of televisions. A single bar had a neon sign that blinked "beer" in a hesitant, stuttering rhythm. I saw a post office, a general store with a hand-painted "closed" sign, and a diner that was, miraculously, still open. Its windows cast warm rectangles of light onto the empty sidewalk. My stomach clenched at the thought of food, but I kept walking. The address on the note didn't have a street name, just a route number and a lot number, a little ways out of the town proper. I checked the street signs under the weak lamplight, got my bearings, and headed toward the edge of town, my footsteps echoing in the profound silence. It was the kind of quiet that feels loud, filled with the hum of electricity in the wires overhead and the distant bark of a dog. The sidewalk ended, and I was walking on the gravel shoulder of the road. The moon was a sliver, offering little light. My eyes slowly adjusted, and the world resolved itself into shades of gray and black. Trees lined the road, their bare branches like skeletal fingers reaching for the sky. It was beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. I felt impossibly small, a tiny, insignificant figure in a vast, sleeping landscape. After about 20 minutes of walking, my phone's GPS, which I was trying to use sparingly to save the battery, told me I was close. I saw it then, set back from the road, almost hidden by a thicket of overgrown sumac and wild grapevines. A long, curved metal roof, rusted in patches, gleaming faintly in the moonlight. A Quonset hut. It was bigger than I expected, a massive, corrugated steel behemoth sitting in the middle of a field of weeds. A chain-link fence, sagging and broken in places, surrounded the property. The gate was held shut with a thick, rusty chain and a heavy-duty padlock. It looked like it hadn't been opened in years. This was it. This had to be it. I felt a surge of something. Disappointment, maybe. It was a wreck. A forgotten piece of junk on a worthless plot of land. Maria was right. My grandfather had left me nothing but a cruel joke. My shoulders slumped. The cold was starting to get deep into my bones now, a real physical ache. What was I supposed to do? Go back to town and beg for a room I couldn't afford? Call my caseworker and admit defeat? I stood there for a long time, just staring at the hulking shape of the hut, the wind whistling through the dead weeds around me. Then I remembered the key. With numb fingers, I pulled the envelope from my pocket one last time. The key felt heavy and real in my palm. It was old, but it was solid. It was a promise. I walked to the gate, my heart pounding a nervous rhythm against my ribs. The padlock was caked with rust, looking as ancient as the hut itself. It seemed impossible that this small brass key would work. I took a deep breath, the cold air stinging my lungs, and slid the key into the lock. It resisted at first, gritty with rust and disuse. I wiggled it gently, pushing harder. For a second, nothing happened. I was about to give up, to accept the finality of my failure. Then, with a sudden, grating click, the mechanism turned. The shackle sprang open. I stood there, stunned, the open padlock dangling from the chain. It worked. He had left this for me. It wasn't a joke. A wave of something warm and sharp washed over me, so potent it felt like grief. He had known I would come. He had trusted that I would find my way here. I pushed the gate open. It screamed in protest, its hinges grinding, but it opened. I stepped onto the property, my boots crunching on the gravel drive. I was home, or at least, I was at the only home I had left. I walked toward the Quonset hut, its curved flank looming over me like the side of a whale. The main door was a huge, sliding panel of steel with another, smaller padlock. My key fit this one, too. With a groan of metal on metal, I slid the heavy door open, just enough to slip through. And then I was inside. The air inside the Quonset hut was thick, cold, and absolutely still. It smelled of dust, of decay, of mice, and of something else, something dry and faintly sweet. Hay. The moonlight that filtered through the grimy skylights was just enough to reveal the impossible sight before me. The cavernous space was filled, almost to the ceiling, with bales of hay. They were stacked in neat, tight rows, creating a narrow, winding corridor that snaked its way into the darkness. It was a maze, a fortress made of grass. I stood frozen in the entrance, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. Why? Why would anyone fill a giant metal building with thousands of hay bales? It made no sense. It was the act of a madman. My flicker of hope from a moment ago guttered and died, replaced by a profound sense of despair. My grandfather had lost his mind before he died. He'd spent his last days, his last dollars, on this monument to insanity. And he'd sent me here. I almost turned and walked away right then. I could slide the door shut, lock it behind me, and just disappear. No one would ever know. I could hitchhike to another town, find another dead-end job, and become another anonymous, lost person. It would be easier. But the cold was biting, and the thought of sleeping in a ditch was worse than the thought of sleeping in a madhouse. And there was still that whisper of a promise. Protect the heart. Reluctantly, I pulled the heavy door shut behind me, plunging the hut into near total darkness. The silence was absolute. I fumbled for my phone, my fingers clumsy with cold, and turned on its flashlight. The beam cut a sharp cone through the dusty air, illuminating the wall of hay in front of me. The bales were old, the twine brittle, the hay itself faded to a pale, silvery yellow. I took a tentative step into the narrow path. The hay walls muffled all sound, creating a strange, claustrophobic quiet. The air was dead. It felt like walking into a tomb. The path was just wide enough for me to pass through with my duffel bag. It twisted and turned, a deliberate labyrinth. I followed it deeper and deeper into the belly of the hut. The flashlight beam danced ahead of me, revealing more and more hay. It was endless. Was this whole building just hay? After what felt like an eternity of walking, the path opened into a small, clear space in the very center of the hut. My light swept across the area, and my breath caught in my throat. It was a room, a small, livable space carved out of the hay. Against one wall was a simple metal-framed cot with a thin mattress and a neatly folded wool blanket. Next to it was a small wooden crate serving as a nightstand. A single, bare bulb hung from a wire overhead, unlit. And at the foot of the cot sat a large, dark green metal footlocker, the kind soldiers use. It was closed, but not locked. I dropped my duffel bag to the dusty concrete floor. The sound was dull, absorbed by the hay. I ran my hand along the rough wool of the blanket on the cot. It was clean. Someone had prepared this place. My grandfather. He hadn't been crazy. This was deliberate. This was for me. My hands were shaking as I knelt in front of the footlocker. It felt like an altar. I hesitated for a long moment, my heart hammering. What was inside? More riddles? More disappointment? Or was this where I would finally find an answer? I lifted the heavy lid. The hinges creaked softly. Inside, the first thing I saw was a thick manila envelope, just like the one I'd received from the lawyer, only bigger. My name, Leo, was written on it in that same familiar, shaky script. Beneath the envelope were stacks of cash. Not a huge amount, but more money than I had ever seen in my life. I counted it quickly, my fingers trembling. $5,000. It was a fortune. It was survival. It was a choice. I could take this money and leave. No one would blame me. I could get a real apartment, go to a community college, build a normal life. I could forget all about this strange metal tomb and its secrets. But there was the envelope. I picked it up. It was heavy. I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my gut, that the real inheritance wasn't the cash. It was whatever was written on the pages inside. I sat on the edge of the cot, the cold concrete seeping through the soles of my shoes, and I opened the envelope. Inside was a letter, 20 pages long, handwritten on yellow legal paper. I took a deep breath, aimed my phone's flashlight at the first page, and began to read. "My dearest Leo," it began. The words swam in front of my eyes for a moment, and I had to stop and wipe them with the back of my hand. It was his voice, clear as day, on the page. "If you are reading this, it means several things. It means I am gone. It means you have turned 18. And it means you kept a promise you didn't understand. For that, I am more proud of you than I can ever say. I am sorry for so much. I am sorry for leaving you alone. I am sorry for the secrecy and the confusion. I need you to understand that everything I have done, every strange and seemingly crazy decision I have made in these last years, has been to protect you, and to protect our legacy. It is not a legacy of money, Leo. I know the world teaches you that money is the only thing that matters, but it's a lie. Our legacy is something far more valuable and far more fragile." I had to pause, my throat tight. I took a few deep breaths of the dusty, still air and read on. The letter was his confession, his explanation, his last will and testament, all rolled into one. He wrote about his work. I had always known he was a botanist, a gardener, but I didn't know the specifics. He had been a seed saver. For 40 years, he had traveled to the forgotten corners of the world, collecting rare and endangered heirloom seeds. He wasn't just a hobbyist, he was an archivist, a genetic librarian, preserving plant species that were being wiped out by industrial agriculture and climate change. His collection was his life's work, a priceless bank of biodiversity. He wrote about a company, a massive agrochemical corporation called Gen Agro. They had tried to hire him to buy his collection. They didn't want to preserve the seeds. They wanted to dissect them, patent their genetic traits, and engineer them into sterile, profitable hybrids. When he refused, they began to harass him. They used legal threats, intimidation. They tried to ruin his reputation, calling him a crank and a charlatan. And then they got more serious. They manufactured a debt. They used a series of shell companies and predatory loans he'd taken out years ago during a medical emergency to create a massive, fraudulent claim against him. They were going to take everything. "I knew I couldn't fight them in court," he wrote. "They have armies of lawyers. I had nothing. I had you. I couldn't risk them taking the collection, and I couldn't risk them coming after you. So I had to make myself disappear. I had to become poor. I sold everything of conventional value, let them think they had bled me dry. I let them take the apartment. I let them believe my life's work was nothing more than a few dusty jars of seeds that were lost in the shuffle. I let them win, so that I could win in the end. This hut, this land, was the one thing he'd managed to protect, a property he'd bought decades ago and put in a trust that was hard for them to touch. His plan was audacious and desperate. He had built a fortress. "The hay, Leo," the letter continued, "is not just hay. It is insulation, It is camouflage. It is a buffer against the world. But its most important job is yet to come. You are sitting in the heart of a machine, and you are its operator. But the machine is dormant. It needs power. And it needs cold. Remember what I wrote on the note? The answer is in the cold. Winter is coming, Leo. The first true deep freeze of the season is the key. You must be ready. He went on to give me instructions. There was an old diesel generator in a small shed behind the hut. He told me where to find the fuel, how to prime it, how to start it. He told me to use the money in the footlocker for supplies, food, warm clothes, fuel. He told me to be patient, to wait for the right moment. The letter ended with a passage that I would read over and over in the coming weeks. This is a heavy burden to place on your shoulders. You are so young, and you deserve a life of lightness and joy, not one spent hiding in the dark. You have a choice. The money in this locker is yours. You can take it and walk away. No one would blame you. You can build a new life for yourself, free of this burden. That is the easier path. Or you can stay. You can see this through. You can protect the heart. It is the harder path, Leo, but I believe it is the one that will lead you not to an easier life, but to a truer one. The choice is yours. Whatever you decide, know that I love you. I folded the letter and put it back in the envelope. My hands were steady now. The fear and confusion had been replaced by a cold, clear sense of purpose. The money on the floor seemed insignificant. The cot, the bare bulb, the walls of hay. They were no longer a prison. They were a sanctuary, a workshop, a battle station. He had left me a choice, but it wasn't a choice at all. How could I walk away? This wasn't just about a collection of seeds anymore. It was about my grandfather's life, his sacrifice. It was about finishing what he started. I lay down on the cot, pulling the rough wool blanket over me. I didn't turn off the flashlight. I just lay there, staring up at the dark, curved ceiling high above, the beam of light a solitary pillar in the immense darkness. I felt the weight of his trust, a pressure that was both terrifying and fortifying. I was not a boy anymore. I was the keeper of a promise, and I would not fail him. The next morning, I woke to a sliver of gray light filtering down from the skylights. The cold was a physical presence, a damp, heavy blanket that had settled over everything. My breath was a cloud in the frigid air. For a moment, I forgot where I was, and a familiar panic seized me. Then I saw the walls of hay, the footlocker, the envelope with my name on it, and it all came rushing back. The panic subsided, replaced by a grim determination. I had work to do. I dressed quickly, pulling on every layer I owned. I ate a stale protein bar from my bag, the last of my food, and drank from my water bottle. Then I took $1,000 from the footlocker, stuffed it into my pocket, and retraced my steps through the hay maze to the main door. Sliding the heavy door open, I was hit by the brilliant, cold morning light. The world looked different than it had in the dark. The property was a mess of weeds and junk, but the sky was a vast, brilliant blue, and the air was crisp and clean. I could see the town of Havenwood nestled in the valley below, a thin plume of wood smoke rising from a chimney. I locked the hut behind me and started the walk into town. My first stop was the diner I had passed last night. It was called the Morning Glory. Inside it was warm and smelled of coffee and bacon. A handful of old-timers sat at the counter, nursing mugs of coffee. A waitress with a kind, tired face and a name tag that read Brenda pointed me to a booth. I ordered pancakes, bacon, eggs, and coffee, and I ate like a starving wolf. It was the best meal I'd ever had. Brenda watched me with a curious but gentle expression. "You're not from around here," she said. It wasn't a question. "No, ma'am," I said, my mouth full of pancake. "Just passing through?" "Something like that," I said, unwilling to offer more. I was an outsider, a stranger. My grandfather's letter had warned me to be careful, to trust no one until I understood the landscape. I paid for my meal with a $50 bill, leaving a generous tip. The warmth of the food and coffee had spread through me, chasing away some of the deep-seated cold. My next stop was the general store. It was a dusty, cluttered place that sold everything from hardware to canned goods to thermal underwear. The man behind the counter was old and wiry, with suspicious eyes. I bought a cart full of supplies: canned soup, pasta, coffee, bread, jerky, a new water bottle, a headlamp to save my phone battery, work gloves, and the warmest socks and long underwear they had. I paid in cash. The man's eyes lingered on the $100 bills, his suspicion deepening. I felt like a criminal. I knew I needed to be more careful. I hauled the bags back to the hut, my arms aching. The walk felt longer this time, heavier. I was a target now, a kid with a mysterious amount of cash in a town where everyone knew everyone else's business. Back inside the hut, the silence and the cold wrapped around me again. But this time, it felt different. It was my space, my fortress. I unpacked the food, organizing it neatly. I laid out my new warm clothes. This was my life now. For the next few weeks, I settled into a routine. I worked. During the day, I explored the property. Behind the hut, just as the letter had said, was a small, dilapidated shed. Inside was the generator. It was an old, beastly thing, a military surplus diesel generator that looked like it belonged on a battleship. It was covered in rust and cobwebs. For days, I worked on it, following my grandfather's meticulous instructions. I drained the old oil, cleaned the fuel lines, replaced the spark plugs I found in a toolbox nearby. I was clumsy at first. I scraped my knuckles, got grease and oil all over my new clothes. But slowly, painstakingly, I began to understand the machine. It was like a puzzle, and with each piece I cleaned and put back in place, I felt a little closer to my grandfather, a little more connected to his plan. I needed fuel. The letter said there were barrels of diesel buried on the property, but finding them was a task for later. I needed a more immediate supply. I bought 2 5-gallon gas cans from the general store and walked to the only gas station in town, a couple of miles in the other direction. I filled them with diesel, and the walk back was brutal, the cans banging against my legs, their weight pulling at my shoulders. I was getting stronger, though. The physical labor was changing me. The softness of a life lived indoors was being stripped away, replaced by a wiry strength. In the evenings, I would sit in my little room in the hay, reading my grandfather's letter by headlamp, memorizing the instructions, absorbing his words. I read the paperback I'd brought, a collection of Jack London stories. I felt a kinship with his characters, men battling the elements, relying on their wits and their endurance to survive in a harsh, indifferent wilderness. I was living my own story of survival. One afternoon, while working on the generator, an old pickup truck pulled up to the gate. My heart leaped into my throat. I ducked behind the shed, my mind racing. Was it Gen Agro? Had they found me? I watched as a woman got out of the truck. She was in her 50s, with sharp, intelligent eyes and graying hair pulled back in a neat bun. She wore a practical pantsuit. She stood at the gate, looking at the new padlock, then at the hut. She wasn't a threat. She looked like a lawyer. She pulled out her phone, and a moment later I heard my own phone buzz in my pocket. It was an unknown number. I let it go to voicemail. A minute later, it buzzed again with a text message. Leo, this is Eleanor Albright. I was your grandfather's attorney. I know you're here. Please, let's talk. I can help. Ms. Albright, the woman who had given my caseworker the envelope. I hesitated. My grandfather had said to trust no one, but he had trusted her. I walked out from behind the shed and approached the gate. She watched me come, her expression unreadable but not unkind. Leo, she said, her voice calm and professional. I'm glad you're safe. How did you know I was here? I asked, my voice raspy. I make it my business to know things, she said with a faint smile. I've been keeping an eye on the property. When I saw the lock had been changed, I figured you'd arrived. Your grandfather asked me to look out for you. She was direct, pragmatic. I found I liked it. I unlocked a gate and let her in. We didn't go inside the hut. I didn't want to show her the interior, not yet. We stood by her truck, the cold wind whipping around us. She got right to the point. Gen Agro's claim on your grandfather's estate is about to come to a head, she said. They've filed a final motion to seize all remaining assets to clear his supposed debt. That includes this land. They think it's worthless, but they are thorough. They'll send an assessor out here in the next few weeks. My blood ran cold. What can we do? For now, we delay, she said. I have filed a counter motion questioning the legitimacy of the debt. It's a long shot, but it will buy us some time. A few months, maybe. What happens after that depends on you. It depends on what your grandfather left for you here. She looked me straight in the eye. He told me his plan, in broad strokes. He said he was leaving you a choice. He trusted you to make the right one. She handed me her card. Call me when you're ready. Call me if you need anything. Fuel, food, legal advice. Your grandfather set up a small trust with me to cover these expenses. You don't have to use your own money. I stared at the card, then back at her. He had thought of everything. He had left me a safety net. Thank you, I said, the words feeling inadequate. Stay safe, Leo, she said, getting back into her truck. And stay warm, winter's coming. As she drove away, I looked at the generator. It wasn't just a machine anymore. It was a weapon, and I had to get it working. Time was running out. The first snow fell a week later. It wasn't the deep freeze my grandfather's letter had described, just a light dusting that coated the brown landscape in a fragile layer of white. But it was a warning. The cold was coming. I had finally gotten the generator to turn over. The first time it coughed to life, roaring like a dragon in the quiet afternoon, I felt a surge of triumph so powerful it almost brought me to my knees. The sound was deafening, a brutal intrusion into the peaceful landscape, but to me, it was the sound of hope. It was the sound of a heartbeat. Following the next set of instructions, I found the heavy-duty electrical cable that ran from the generator shed into the wall of the Quonset hut. It had been buried in a shallow trench, hidden under weeds and dirt. Inside the hut, I had to dig through a section of the hay wall to find where the cable terminated. A large, industrial-grade breaker box. With the generator running, I threw the main switch. The bare bulb in my little living space flickered and then glowed to life, casting a steady yellow light. It was a small victory, but it felt enormous. I was no longer living in darkness. I spent the next few days in a state of nervous anticipation, watching the weather reports on my phone. I hauled more diesel, stockpiling it. I reinforced the hay walls, stuffing loose bits into any gaps, making my fortress as tight as I could. The townspeople were getting used to the sight of me. I was the strange kid who lived out at the old Miller place. They didn't know my name was Leo. To them, I was just the Miller boy's grandson. Brenda at the diner always had a hot cup of coffee waiting for me. The old man at the general store had started to nod at me, a grudging sign of acceptance. I was becoming part of the landscape, a local curiosity. Then the forecast I had been waiting for arrived. An Arctic front was moving down from Canada. The news called it a polar vortex. Temperatures were predicted to drop to 20 below zero, with wind chills making it feel like 40 below. This was it, the deep freeze. The night the front arrived, the wind howled around the Quonset hut, a mournful, shrieking sound. The metal walls groaned and popped under the assault of the cold. Inside my hay cocoon, it was still and quiet, but I could feel the temperature dropping precipitously. It was time. I bundled up in every layer I owned, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. I pulled on my headlamp, took a deep breath, and walked to the back of the hut, following the winding path to its end. The path stopped at a solid wall of hay bales. According to the letter, this was the final door. Behind these bales was the machine my grandfather had built. I started pulling them away. They were heavy, dense, and coated in a fine layer of frost that had seeped through the metal walls. I worked systematically, creating a pile of discarded bales in the narrow corridor. My breath came in ragged plumes in the beam of my headlamp. The air here was colder than anywhere else in the hut, a deep, penetrating cold that felt ancient. After I'd removed a dozen bales, I hit something hard and smooth. Not the corrugated steel of the hut's wall, something else. I pulled away the last few bales that were obscuring it. It was a door, a massive, insulated door, the kind you'd find on a commercial walk-in freezer. It was flush with the wall, its existence completely hidden by the hay. A heavy industrial latch held it shut. This was it, the heart of the machine. I had to get the generator running. I made my way back through the maze, my boots crunching on the frozen ground, and went outside. The cold was a physical blow. It stole the air from my lungs and burned my face. The wind was a solid wall, trying to push me back. I fought my way to the shed, my gloved hands already numb. Starting the generator in this cold was going to be difficult. I primed it, my fingers fumbling with the controls. I pulled the cord. Nothing. Just a dull, metallic clunk. The oil was too thick, the diesel on the verge of gelling. I tried again and again, pulling with all my strength, my muscles screaming in protest. The engine sputtered, coughed a puff of black smoke, and died. "Come on," I whispered, my words swallowed by the wind. "Please." I thought of my grandfather. I thought of his sacrifice. I thought of the promise I'd made. I gave the cord one last desperate pull, throwing my entire body weight into it. The engine caught. It sputtered, faltered, and then roared to life, its thunderous noise a defiant shout against the storm. I let it run for 10 minutes, letting it warm up before heading back inside the hut. The single bulb was glowing. Power was flowing. I went back to the freezer door. A low hum was now coming from the wall above it. The refrigeration unit, powered by the generator, was working. It was pulling the last of the heat from the sealed chamber, using the Arctic air outside to work more efficiently. The answer is in the cold. It wasn't a riddle, it was physics. I put my hand on the latch. It was ice cold, the metal burning my glove. I pulled. It was heavy, sealed tight by a vacuum. I braced my feet and threw my shoulder into it. With a great sucking sound, the seal broke, and the heavy door swung inward. A blast of intensely cold, dry air rolled out, a visible fog in my headlamp beam. It smelled of nothing. It was the sterile, lifeless smell of absolute zero. I stood at the threshold, peering into the darkness within. This was the sanctum, the culmination of my grandfather's life, of my journey. I stepped inside. The room was not large, maybe 10 feet by 10 feet. The walls were lined with stainless steel shelves, and on the shelves, meticulously organized and labeled, were hundreds of small, sealed glass jars. Each jar was filled with seeds. Tiny black specks, larger striped seeds, mottled brown ones, smooth white ones. It was a library of life, frozen in time. In the center of the room, on a small metal table, was one final item, a small lacquered wooden box, and on top of it, another envelope. I picked it up. My fingers were so numb I could barely feel the paper. I opened it and pulled out a single sheet. The handwriting was weaker this time, more spidery. "You did it, Leo," it said. "You are standing in the heart. This is our legacy. It is not land or money. It is the future. It is a bank of resilience in a world that has forgotten its value. What you do with it now defines who you are. The choice, as always, is yours. But I know you'll make the right one. I believe in you." I looked at the shelves, at the hundreds of tiny, sleeping lives held in stasis. I thought about Gen Agro, the faceless corporation that wanted to dissect and own this. They saw a resource to be exploited. My grandfather saw a sacred trust. And now it was my trust. I looked at the wooden box on the table. It was beautiful, inlaid with mother of pearl. I opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of black velvet, was not another jar of seeds. It was a single, perfect, dried sunflower. And next to it, a small packet of paper containing its seeds. A label on the packet read, "Helianthus Leo's Light," a variety he had developed himself, a variety he had named after me. Tears froze on my cheeks. I cried for my grandfather, for his love and his faith in me. I cried for the lonely, lost boy I had been, and I cried for the man I was now becoming, a guardian of this silent, frozen garden. I had found the heart. Now I had to protect it. The next day, with the generator shut down and the freezer door sealed tight again, I called Eleanor Albright. I told her I was ready. She arrived that afternoon, her pickup truck crunching through the fresh snow. This time, I led her inside the hut. I led her through the hay maze to my small living area. She took in the cot, the single bulb, the stacks of canned food, her expression neutral, but her eyes missing nothing. "Your grandfather was a remarkable man," she said softly. "You have no idea," I replied. I handed her the 2 letters. She sat on the edge of the cot and read them both, her face a mask of concentration. When she was finished, she looked up at me, and for the first time, I saw a crack in her professional armor. There was a profound sadness in her eyes, mixed with a fierce respect. "He really did it," she murmured. "He built an ark." "What do we do now?" I asked. "Now we fight," she said, her voice regaining its steel. "But you need to understand the stakes. Gen Agro's legal team is formidable. They will paint your grandfather as a delusional eccentric, a debtor who hid assets. They will try to seize this land, and if they do, they will tear this place apart. They won't know what they're looking for, but they'll find that freezer eventually." She laid out my options, and they were the same ones my grandfather had offered. Option 1, the easy path. "The collection in that freezer," she said, "is priceless to the right people. Not corporations, but private collectors, sovereign seed banks, botanical consortiums. I could broker a sale. You would be a multi-millionaire, Leo. You could walk away from all of this, set up a foundation in your grandfather's name, and live whatever life you choose. You would be safe. The seeds would be safe. It would be an honorable end to the story. It was tempting. So tempting. A life without struggle, without fear. A life where I didn't have to live in a cold metal hut, worrying about fuel for a generator and lawyers from a faceless corporation. I could go to college, travel, never worry about money again. Then she laid out option 2. Or, she said, her voice dropping, you can take the harder path. You can fight them. We can use the existence of the seed bank as leverage. We can expose what Gen Agro tried to do to your grandfather. We can turn this into a public battle. But it will be ugly. They will drag your name and his through the mud. It will be long, expensive, and draining. And the outcome is not guaranteed. If we win, you keep the land, you keep the collection. But you'll be a custodian, not a millionaire. You'll have a responsibility, a life's work. You'll have to learn to be what your grandfather was. It was the choice between being rich and being right, between freedom and purpose. I thought about the sunflower seeds in the wooden box, the ones named for me, Leo's light. My grandfather hadn't saved those seeds to make me rich. He'd saved them to give me a reason to shine. What would you do? I asked her. She looked surprised by the question. She thought for a moment. When I was a young lawyer, I went to work for a big firm. I wanted to make a lot of money. I did for a while, and I was miserable. I moved here to this town to have a smaller life, a more meaningful one. Your grandfather was one of my first clients. He taught me that some things are worth more than money. She stood up. I can't make this choice for you, Leo, but I know which path I'm hoping you'll take. She didn't need to say it. I already knew. The thought of selling the seeds, of turning my grandfather's legacy into a bank account, felt like a betrayal. It would be like selling his soul, and my own. We fight, I said. The words were quiet, but they echoed in the hay-baffled room with the weight of an oath. A slow smile spread across Eleanor's face. Good, she said. Then let's get to work. The weeks that followed were a blur of activity. Eleanor began her legal assault, filing motions and injunctions, burying the Gen Agro lawyers in a mountain of paperwork. My role was different. I had to become a student. Eleanor brought me boxes of my grandfather's books, textbooks on botany, soil science, genetics, organic farming. She brought me a laptop and a satellite internet hookup. In my little room, surrounded by hay, illuminated by a single bulb, I began to study. I read about the plants whose seeds were frozen behind the wall. I learned their histories, their needs, their unique properties. I read my grandfather's own journals, which Eleanor had also kept safe. His notes were filled with observations, drawings, and a deep, abiding love for the natural world. He wasn't just a scientist, he was a poet. He wrote about the way a particular bean vine curled toward the sun, the precise shade of blue on a rare corn kernel. I was learning more than botany. I was learning his language. I was learning his heart. As the legal battle raged in courtrooms I never saw, I began the practical work. The ground was frozen solid, but I could prepare. I cleared a section of the land, pulling weeds, testing the soil as my grandfather's books instructed. I found the buried diesel barrels, giving me a fuel supply that would last for years. I was transforming the property, and it was transforming me. I was no longer a boy hiding from the world. I was a man building one. One day, a black SUV with tinted windows pulled up to the gate. A man in an expensive suit got out. He didn't look like a lawyer. He looked like a wolf. He called my name. I met him at the gate, my heart pounding, but my face calm. "Leo," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "My name is Mr. Corbin. I'm a senior vice president at Gen Agro. I think you and I should have a conversation. We've been adversaries in court, but there's no need for us to be enemies." He offered me a deal, a final, generous offer. They would drop their claim on the land. They would give me a check for $5 million. All they wanted was what was in the freezer. They even knew it was a freezer. Their intelligence was good. "Your grandfather was a brilliant man," Corbin said, his eyes cold and empty. "But he was sentimental. That collection, it's a biological treasure trove. In our hands, it could help feed the world. In yours, it will rot in a freezer in the middle of nowhere. Don't you want to be part of the solution, Leo?" I knew what he meant. Feed the world was corporate speak for own the patents. Solution meant profit. He was offering me the easy way out one last time. The ultimate temptation. $5 million. I could be anywhere in the world, doing anything I wanted. I looked past him at the rusty Quonset hut, at the field I had started to clear. I thought of my grandfather's letter, of the sunflower named for me. I thought of the choice between an easy life and a true one. "This land isn't for sale," I said, "and neither is my grandfather's legacy." Corbin's smile vanished. The mask fell, and for a second I saw the predator underneath. "You're making a mistake, kid," he hissed. "A $5 million mistake." "No," I said, looking him straight in the eye. "I'm making a choice." He got back in his SUV and drove away, leaving a cloud of dust and exhaust. I stood at the gate for a long time after he was gone. I had been tested, and I hadn't broken. The fear was still there, a low hum beneath the surface, but it was overshadowed by something else. A sense of peace, a sense of rightness. I had chosen my ground, and I would defend it. That spring, as the last of the snow melted and the ground began to thaw, I did something I had been dreaming of all winter. With my own hands, in the rich, dark soil I had prepared, I planted the seeds from the packet labeled Helianthus Leo's Light. It was just a small patch of earth, a beginning. But as I pressed the seeds into the soil, I felt the true meaning of my inheritance. It wasn't the land or the hut or even the frozen library of seeds. It was this, the act of planting, the promise of growth, the choice to cultivate life in a world that often chose destruction. The story doesn't end there, of course. The legal battle with Gen Agro dragged on for another year before they finally gave up, worn down by Eleanor's tenacity and the bad press that started to emerge about their predatory practices. We won. The land was mine, free and clear. The hut is my home now. It's warmer than it used to be. I've insulated it properly and installed a small wood stove. The hay is gone, replaced by shelves of books and tools. The freezer remains, a silent, cold heart, a reminder of the promise I kept. I've started a nonprofit, the Miller Seed Sanctuary, dedicated to preserving and distributing the seeds my grandfather saved. People come from all over now, farmers, gardeners, scientists, to learn, to share, and to collect seeds to grow in their own communities. The legacy is no longer frozen. It's alive and spreading. Last summer, the sunflowers bloomed. They grew taller than I was, a brilliant, defiant sea of yellow, all turning their faces to the sun. They were beautiful, and they were just the beginning. I found my home, not in a building, but in a purpose. I learned that inheritance isn't what you're given, it's what you choose to do with it. My grandfather left me a choice, and I chose the harder path. It hasn't been easy, but it has been true. It has been my own. This story was about finding a home and a promise, about choosing responsibility over riches. We all have those choices in our lives, big and small. The easier wrong, or the harder right. If you've ever had to build your own home, your own family, your own purpose from scratch, I want to hear about it. Share your story in the comments below. Let's make this a place where those stories are honored. A community of people who understand what it means to plant a seed in difficult soil and wait for the sun. Thank you for listening. Please subscribe so we can keep sharing the stories that matter. You're not alone in this.